5-6 Graph of other trig functions, day 3. In this lesson, we're going to look at tangent and cotangent. So tangent, remember, is the y over the x, or you divide the y coordinate by the x. So looking at my unit circle, at 0, if I divide y over x, I'm going to get 0. At pi over 2, if I divide the y over x, it is undefined. So as I'm plotting on my graph, pi over 2 will have a vertical asymptote. At pi, if I divide y over 0, I'll get 0 again. At 3 pi over 2, if I divide the y over 0, I would get, it would be undefined, so there's another vertical asymptote. And back at 2 pi is 0. Now what's different from tangent is when in between your asymptotes, you have what are called the quarter points. At those quarter points is where your tangent graph occurs. So to graph tangent, we use negative a, 0, and a. So tangent only requires 3 points to make the graph. And on the other side, you'll only see like half of the curve. So a and negative a are used to graph the curve. So there's no amplitude. Your period is pi over b. Phase shift is the same. You're either moving left or right, C units. So if you see plus, you're actually moving right. If you see minus, if you see minus, you're moving right. If you see plus, you're moving left. Your midline is still y equals d. And key points, you only need 3. That's our magic number. And you still do 1/4 times your period to get your quarter points. And don't forget your first x starts at your phase shift. This is our first tangent graph, and what I do first is I identify A, which is 2, B is 1, C is positive pi over 6, and my D value is 1. So period is always pi over b, which will be pi. Phase shift, we're moving right, pi over 6. Midline is y equals 1. So you remember your first x starts at your phase shift. And to get your other x values, you're going to take 1/4 times your period, which is pi over 4 is what we're adding each time. Now be careful because sometimes your denominators are not the same, like in this case. So you would take pi over 6 and get a common denominator. So I'm going to make them both 12. So 2 pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 is 5 pi over 12. So my pi over 4, I always have to multiply it by 3 to make it 12. So I'll do that. I like that. 5 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 is 8 pi over 12. 8 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 is 11 pi over 12. Notice they're adding by 3 each time. And that's funny because that's what we use to get a common denominator. And the last one is 14 pi over 12. So I'm going to take those x values, place them on my graph, starting at pi over 6. Now that tangent curve, remember, looks a little different from our other graphs. And our midline is at 1. So your a values, since a is 2, are going to be 2 up from 1 and 2 down from 1. So that would be your new A. So this would be A, and this would be negative A. Okay, so the first y coordinate for tangent, remember, starts at 0. And at the next x would be your A value, or our new A. And at 8 pi over 12, we're going to have our first asymptote. And then we would start at negative A, and then 0. So this is how the curve would look. Now, if you want to draw the other side so you can see negative A here and positive A here, you can. So that'll be 17 pi over 12. Let's look at what happens when you have a tangent graph with the negative A. So if you want, you can rewrite this. So A is negative 3, B is 1/2, C is 0, D is 0. So your period is 2 pi, pi divided by B, which is the same thing as pi times 2 over 1, which is 2 pi. Phase shift, none, which means our first x is at 0. Midline, y equals 0. 1/4 times your period to help you get your key points, which is pi over 2. So we're going to add pi over 2 each time. And then we will get pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2. And you just place your x values on your graph. Remember, you can reduce it or not. Midline is at 0. Our A, and negative A. Okay, remember, at your first x, tangent starts at 0. Then we would do negative A on the left and positive A on the right. But since it is negative A, it's going to look like this. Here, then here, then you have your asymptote. You start all over. A, 0, and then you would have another negative A. And you can show it or not. Some people like to go a little more. Do 5 pi over 2, and at 6 pi over 2, you would have another asymptote. Okay, cotangent graph is, remember, the reciprocal of tangent. And so when you find cotangent, you would divide the x over the y. So at 0, when you divide the x over the y, you start off with it being undefined. And then at pi over 2 is 0. At pi, it's undefined. At 3 pi over 2 is 0. And back at 2 pi, it's undefined. And remember, in between the asymptotes, you have quarter points. And so for cotangent, the graph would be A, 0, negative A. So that's what makes cotangent different from tangent. So everything else is the same. Period, phase shift, midline. Still need 3 points. Do 1/4 times your period. Your first x starts at your phase shift. The only difference is the curve. A, 0, negative A. So looking at our first example for cotangent, A is 2, B is 1, C is negative pi over 6, and D is negative 1. Your period is still pi over B, which is pi. Your phase shift, we're moving left, pi over 6. Your midline is y equals -1. So your first x is at -pi over 6. Get your key points. You're doing 1/4 times your period, which is pi over 4. So that's what you're adding each time. So we're going to take -pi over 6 and add pi over 4. Remember, you have to get a common denominator. So I'm going to multiply by 2, multiply by 3. So you have -2 pi over 6 plus, over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 gives us 1 pi over 12. You're going to take that and add it. Get a common denominator just for the second one. So 1 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 gives us 4 pi over 12. 4 pi over 12. Just get a common denominator for the second one. Plus 3 pi over 12 is 7 pi over 12. And you take that and add your last fraction. 7 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12 is 10 pi over 12. So I'm going to go over here and put my x values. And remember, you can reduce it or you can leave it as is. And remember, we have a vertical at, a midline at -1. That's your new 0. And our points, or our A values, are going to be 2 above the line and 2 below. So, for cotangent, remember at your first x, you have an asymptote. Cotangent is a little easier to see. At pi over 12, remember you go A, but you know we have to go 2 up. 0, or -A, and then your asymptote. For our last graph, we're going to see what happens to a cotangent graph with the -A. And B is pi over 4. And remember, if you want to write this over, so you can see x minus 0 plus 0. C is 0, D is 0. Period is pi divided by B, which is the same thing as pi times the reciprocal. Look what happens to the pi. So your period is 4. Your phase shift is none. So our first x is at 0. Midline is y equals 0. Get your key points. You're going to do 1/4 times your period, which is 1. So you will be adding 1 each time. So this graph shouldn't be bad. I like this one. This one doesn't look bad. Okay, so I go over here. There's no pi this time. Midline is at 0. Alright, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, cotangent starts with a vertical asymptote. Now, usually we would do A, 0, -A, but since A is negative, we're going to do -A, 0, A, and then your asymptote. So a negative cotangent looks like tangent.